one thing to think about is inside of the headless world is there's a lot of different pieces that need to be connected. And Vercel does a fantastic job of kind of piecing those together and making it really easy for developers to kind of move around in this space.
Hi, and welcome back to the WordPress Edge podcast, the ultimate destination for professionals looking to harness the power of WordPress for large-scale enterprise solutions. I am your host, Landon DePasquale, Strategic Clients Director here at AmericanEagle.com. In this episode, we're going to the edge with leveraging Headless for your enterprise WordPress stack. I'm joined here with Matt Jared, Senior Sales Engineer from Vercel. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Landon. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Matt. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm so excited to be here. I think there's just so much interesting opportunity for WordPress and Vercel, so much overlap, especially, speaking about folks who are considering going headless. I'm just really excited to chat with you guys. I think there's so much interesting things going on, like I was saying.
Fantastic. Me too. So why don't we start off with Matt? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Introduce us to the folks at home.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Landon said a second ago, is Matt Jared. I'm located in Austin, Texas. I've been here for a little over 12 years. I started my career in Cincinnati, which is where I'm from. And I've been in Austin for 12 years. I moved here with the goal to do two things: learn to code and work with startups. And when you do that, you can't just like show up and work at a startup and know how to code. So I actually had to kind of take a little bit of a circuitous route to get to where I am today. One of which I think would be interesting for this crowd is working at a startup accelerator. Was one of the first jobs that I had, and I was the front desk guy / event person. And one of the startups that was in the space was actually WP Engine.
Oh yeah.
So the entire founding team of WP Engine, I delivered their Amazon packages to them when I started my career 12 years ago.
That's awesome.
So I'm very, very familiar with the WordPress world. From there, it was a kind of a hopped around a bunch of different things as I built out my skill set, and ended up working at a number of different startups as a consultant, contractor, freelancer type of thing, and then moved on to a company called thezebra.com. If you watch an Austin FC game at any chance, you'll see an ad for thezebra.com. It's kind of like a kayak for car insurance. I started there as the 6th engineer, and I left as the 60th. And focused on building out front ends. And this was kind of a little bit of an interesting one. I focused mostly on the SEO content. So this is going to be kind of an interesting little, we had a little bit of an interesting setup there where you were using Django and Wagtail, which is a whole separate kind of can of worms. And then moved on from the Zebra after building out the team there, like I said, and then went to Atlassian, where I was an engineer like 2000 of 2000, and then stayed there for about 4.5 years. I was on a number of different projects there. I was on a community site, which is one of the largest traffic sites on Atlassian that Atlassian owns. So I had a lot of experience there, and then moved on to some different products. And then towards the end of my time at Atlassian, I was looking for something slightly different to get away from being in the code all day, but I still wanted to stay extremely close to the front end web development world, because that's where the majority of by that point, that's where the majority of my career had been. So I naturally just immediately looked at Vercel, which is I've been a long-time customer, a long-time lover of the product, and was fortunate enough to come on as a sales engineer there. And I've been there for almost 2 years now. So I've had an amazing amount of opportunity and luck come my way over the years, and I'm just really thankful for all of what's come my way. And most of it, like I said, has been in the front end space with lots of WordPress, lots of different CMSs, and then lots of different things that have kind of lots of curveballs, I would say, have been thrown my way over the years.
Awesome. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. So just to kick right off, we mentioned Headless in the intro for the podcast, and we've got a wide variety of folks that listen to this podcast. So for those who may have heard the word headless, but they aren't quite sure what it means, or they kind of think they know what it means, but they're not exactly 100% on that, why don't you give us a high-level idea of what headless is?
Absolutely. I will say one of the main things about headless to keep in mind is that this is typical in our world in technology. There's like 5 different names that you can think of for headless. So right up front, you might be coming to headless and say like, well, what's the difference between headless? What's the difference between composable? What's the difference between Jamstack or a front end cloud or things like that? And these are all basically the exact same thing. They all are just using different names in different contexts. So when we talk about headless in more of like the media or like the WordPress and like a traditional CMS kind of connotation, this is where we're actually detaching the deployment facilities away from the content and allowing other things to kind of touch into that deployment side. So here's where and this is where the term headless comes from. Closely related would be Jamstack is another word you may have heard. But essentially what we're doing is, like I said, is we're taking the content and we're taking certain backend things and we're decoupling them from the actual deployment. So the content's going to live in one place, whether that's in WordPress or a similar CMS. And the actual deployment, what that means is where the WordPress content is getting deployed to is not going to be a managed WordPress service. It will be another service or something like Atlas from WP Engine. For us at Vercel, we are first and foremost a headless place. So this is a headless shop. So here's where we started, where we wanted to deploy React applications with whatever's on the back end. It doesn't matter if it's WordPress or it doesn't matter if it's some kind of a database. We want to build those React applications and then deploy those off into the world. Over the years, that actually spun into our stewardship of the Next.js framework. So this is where Next.js comes from. Is spun out of the need to have a full stack framework that can manage these exact same workloads that allows us to go headless. A similar situation here now that's come over in the last couple of years is a term called composable. And this is where this is kind of more proactive rather than reactive. So if we're coming from a place with a WordPress, what we call monolith, where everything is inside of one monolith, and we want to rip out the deployment the deployment facilities and actually just drop in the content to somewhere else, that's where headless comes from. But if someone's maybe starting from scratch, they're going to compose these different pieces. So we're going to compose our CMS layer, we're going to compose our ecom layer, we're going to compose our data layer. And those are all going to be sort of like, there's going to need to be a connective tissue that actually gets this out into the world. And this is where Vercel sits. So this is the exact way that Vercel kind of is structured, is to be, the place for us to deploy really, really fast websites, no matter the backend, and to have really, really fast teams. So one thing to think about is inside of the headless world is there's a lot of different pieces that need to be connected. And Vercel does a fantastic job of kind of piecing those together and making it really easy for developers to kind of move around in this space.
And that's really the core of that composable experience, right? It's taking a bunch of different best-in-class services and wrapping them all together in a singular experience so that your users on the site are having the best possible experience that they can.
Exactly. Yeah. And this kind of like points back to one of the terms I used a second ago, is a front end cloud. So this is a lot of times what we call ourselves at Vercel is a front end cloud. So imagine you're in a world where I have a ton of content in WordPress, but my site's maybe not operating as quick as I want it to. And I want to add in like an e-commerce layer or like an AI chatbot and a bunch of different things. Traditionally in the WordPress world, I'm kind of like the first thing I'm going to do is reach for plugins. And the first thing I'm going to do is like kind of try and cobble together some themes. Maybe I need to change my theme, things like that. And that is incredibly, incredibly powerful. Like that alone makes WordPress so amazing and useful in our world. I mean, there's a reason why 40 to 50% of the internet is run by WordPress, right? Like this is like so massively powerful that you can do that. But there is a line where I've gone from, hey, this plugin doesn't do precisely what I need, or maybe it's not as secure as my requirements are wanting. Maybe my site needs to be a little bit faster than what I'm getting out of the box from a typical provider. And here's where someone like Vercel comes in, where it's like, I have a development team who's going to be able to help me piece these tools together. And it's going to get me the absolute best of WordPress, which is managing the content, whether it's in Gutenberg, whether it's in a traditional setting, whatever it might be. I'm going to have that content stay in WordPress. And maybe I have a database that lives somewhere. Like I want to use like a cloud database service for context forms, or I have a bunch of middleware services that are kind of piecing together different things for my SaaS product. And instead of using all of that inside of maybe like a WordPress setting, like we maybe have done 10, 15 years ago, I want to actually go more like a traditional developer workflow for that. And another one that often comes up is e-commerce. So instead of maybe using like the typical kind of monolith e-commerce, maybe there's just like a couple small pieces that I want to take away from WordPress and put into a totally different service. Like you're saying, Landon, here's where I have the absolute best of whatever service I want. And Vercel is going to sit on top of that. The conduit for this is going to be the Next.js framework. We do deploy over 37 front-end frameworks, but Next.js is our bread and butter. Like I said before, we're the creators and maintainers of it. It's the #1 web application framework in the world right now, and is the absolute best way to connect these pieces together with your actual software team, right? So with your development team, they're going to build the connection pieces that's going to bring these tools together, and then deploying all of that with Vercel is really what we've made our name for. This is what we do the best.
Awesome. Why would someone choose headless? What are some of the benefits of going headless?
Yeah, I think one of the main things to think of is that it's really hard, and I mentioned this term before, is when you say a monolith. So if I go from WordPress monolith, so I picked a theme off the rack, and my business has exploded, and it's gone really really well. What I want to do is I need to get the best of all of these pieces together, but it's really really hard for me to lean on just one service to do that. And when I say just one service, what I mean is I need to have a bookkeeping service, and that bookkeeping service has like webhooks that my like data engineering team is passing things through to. My team needs to move extremely fast and be able to build stuff at a breakneck speed, and we need to be able to like collaborate with one another. And what I also need to do is get out of people's way, right? So as an engineer, a lot of times what we want to do is build something once and let somebody else kind of like hammer on this as much as they possibly can, and then like kind of get out of the way. And in the headless world, this is kind of our way of like shipping our org chart in a way. We're going to say like, okay, the marketing team is going to live in the CMS. Maybe the data team is going to live inside of this other data service. And instead of forcing them to live on top of each other and try and like hope that our service is going to work, you're going to pick those best services for those teams. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and be able to like deploy all that under one hood still. So we don't need to actually like deploy all these separately and manage all these separately all the time. We can set them up once, allow our teams to kind of do their thing forever inside of that ecosystem. And we still have access to the absolute best tools. So this is on more of like the business side and the content side. The other side of going headless, and this is one of the main things on the engineering side, is the actual performance gain. So when you look at deploying a site to traditional WordPress, every single time you actually hit publish, and every single time you actually really do anything, you have to ship that whole site up and into the cloud. When you use Vercel, what you're doing is you're actually slicing off small pieces of your site and shipping that individually each time out. So when I say I'm going to make a content update, there's methodologies on our side, such as a rendering methodology called incremental static regeneration, where what I'm going to do is actually just going to update the content, and it's just going to go update the pieces of content that I want up on my site in just small microscopic deploys, rather than having to roll the whole ball of tape back up and then push it down the hill and then hope that it lands in the correct spot. Here's where we're going to be very surgical and very precise in how we're going to be doing things. So that's one of the main things that people look at, is when their team needs to become very precise and our site needs to be very performant. So that's the other piece, is instead of deploying our whole entire WordPress monolith, we have a Next.js site, and our Next.js site is going to focus on deploying very, very fast pieces to this. And we're going to do this at the edge. So this is, it's possible to deploy WordPress at the edge. It's possible to do all these different things. But if you start with headless and start at the edge, that's how we actually can gain the most from our setup and from our deployment. So we're going to actually have our deployment anytime our users are actually going to request our application. Our deployment in our application is actually going to be really, really close to them. So it is possible to do this with WordPress, but doing this natively with a headless setup makes it a lot easier and faster to go ahead and start with your team. Like start with the end in mind, I think is the point I'm trying to make here.
Yeah. Are there challenges as well to using headless? It sounds like everything you said is fantastic. Why wouldn't everyone want every site to be on headless everywhere and always?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's maybe some folks at home nodding along and saying like, yeah, I can choose all these different things. There's a million different kind of pieces to this. And then they're starting to think to themselves, well, wait, there's a million different things and a million different pieces to this. Like this, I have a lot of like help with this, but maybe this is not that great because I have to manage a bunch of stuff. So that's kind of the thing, is there can be an argument made where you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Like I'm actually taking some of the complexity away from the WordPress monolith, but I'm just making it like harder because there's 300 services. It's kind of like canceling your cable to have Netflix, Hulu, HBO, Netflix, and like
Yeah.
and whatever other things that we have, right? So, and that's kind of one of the things that is required from a team, is we do have to be able to manage that complexity on the other side, right? So with great power comes great responsibility. Because we can move so much faster, and because the different pieces of the site are going to be more like microscopically contained, it does require a little bit of extra brain effort, and there are some extra calories spent on that side. But the gains are going to be so much higher, meaning that if I want to make my site extremely performant, so if I have an e-commerce site which is using, monolith, whatever it is, not even WordPress, having to like any sort of control over moving this forward and actually being able to manage this and get it very, very precise in the web performance side is actually really difficult, because there's lots of things that have already been built for us that we kind of have to fight. So there's complexity on one side or the other. And if you're new to headless, you might think to yourself, well, wow, there's all these different services. It's so complex. This is maybe not as good as I'm thinking. But the benefits of actually being able to move very quickly reduce that complexity really quickly. So the benefits of having an extremely fast site right out of the gate are really where a lot of people start. And we really want to focus on making sure that our site is really, really, really fast. The other side of that is that flexibility is going to allow our dev team to move really quickly. So that complexity that we've kind of pushed into this headless composable world is not as bad, because we can iterate really quickly. So it might seem like, hey, there's a million other different services that I'm getting here, and this is not what I really want. But really, once you get into it and you can actually start moving quickly, you can see that there's quite a bit of things that we can do, that the complexity is not that crazy. And again, I kind of made this point earlier, whereas like once we get going with the content team, there's a little bit of complexity there that we have, but the content's being written by the content team and they're in their own lane, kind of working and doing certain things. The data is flowing from my team to another if I'm running a SaaS product or something like that, where the data is flowing out of our application from my headless, setup often into some data lake. And now I'm kind of operating in this way. And my development team can now iterate really, really quickly to improve all those things. So the complexity is one of the big kind of takeaways for headless, but this is sort of it's going to be complex either way. And you don't really have the benefit of being headless, but you still have the negative of being complex as you get further into the monolith world.
Yeah, and I think WordPress is thus an interesting fit there, right? How does WordPress fit into that whole headless or composable stack when we think about that complexity?
Yeah, and I think this is one of my favorite parts, and this is why I think WordPress is so powerful. Is so WordPress can port itself from WordPress as a monolith, and here's my giant ball of tape that's my WordPress monolith, whatever it might be. And when I go over to WordPress headless, the only thing that changes is where it's being deployed to. All of my content can stay the same. And it's on my engineering team and on my engineering leadership and the leadership of the business to make sure that we have like the right content model and that our team's in the right place and we're deploying in the right situation. But really nothing changes for where the content is actually being deployed from. Where the content is actually being written at. So I can continue to write. If I don't know the first thing about code or websites or anything like that, and I'm a content writer or I'm a contractor, or I'm a person on the marketing team who needs to make a change to something, I don't need to really care about any of the other pieces of all this. I'm just going to go into WordPress and I'm going to go make those, push those knobs and turn those levers, whatever it is. And then my content's going to show up on the right page. What happens is WordPress now is gotten another level of superpowers when we go into the headless world, because now we can unleash a development team on this. And a development team can go make this extremely quick. They can use whatever they want to do outside of WordPress. So if I were to stay inside of a monolith and I were to say, hey, I want to add, for conversation's sake, a contact form that goes through some like automated piece of software to make sure that we know who this person is and we're gonna talk to them, right? I'm sure there's a plugin somewhere that does that, like this contact form that makes sure that the person's real, adds it into my Salesforce or another CRM, and sends an automated mailer to them. Like I'm sure I could piece all of that together inside of WordPress in some way, shape, or form. But what if I just want to use some existing API that already does that for me? Right. So like I would kind of be able to do that inside of a WordPress monolith. I could still do all that. But there's the idea that I have to go figure out where in WordPress to do this, what version of things we're on, where things sit in terms of like our development cadence. And I don't want to like blow up the content. I know this is going back a little bit, but there used to hear horror stories when I first started doing WordPress theme development many, many years ago, that people would go into the loop and change the loop and take down the whole site. I would have the white site of death and I have to call WP Engine. Remember, I would hear a lot of support calls. How many sites have been taken down because somebody was in the loop and they wrote some bad PHP and the whole thing went down, right? So the idea that we need to do small things in the headless world, we kind of have to really, really go deep in the WordPress world. That kind of goes away. So I can still be in the WordPress world. I can still understand deeply what's going on with certain like content models and things like that. My content doesn't move. My actual marketing team doesn't move, whatever that is. But my development team can really be anybody. The idea that I'm going to take my site down because I misconfigured like the loop. When I say the loop, that's like the part of what makes WordPress. and how we actually loop through all of posts to get that deployed. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually open this up to any front-end web developer who can just come in and change and say like, hey, I actually just want to connect to this API. And here's my contact form that's going to come through here. And I'm going to send this off into the world. And that kind of leads me to my next point, which is just like the pool of things that you can do outside of WordPress, even though WordPress is so huge, is so vast. So that's why you would want to go to Headless, is so you can actually have access to this greater world and not be confined to just what's available as a plugin or what's just available for my WordPress expert who I've been working with, who maybe I can't get a hold of right now. Another round of horror stories. We all have, the WordPress expert or whatever dev expert that we have. If you move over to the headless architecture, it's pretty much any web developer who can do anything, because that's the most popular framework in the world right now. You don't have to kind of focus on like a Drupal or Sitecore or PHP or whatever it might be. We're going to go to any web developer in the world now can update things for me. So the hiring pool is much bigger. So on the business side, that actually does kind of give us an advantage there.
I think one of the interesting things I found with WordPress in a headless environment, Meekum was a headless WordPress instance. We've done podcasts and info on them. But the ability to have all of your content in a single, easy to use, really robust, really mature CMS, but that also makes it incredibly easy to consume that content in a variety of other areas because of the advances in the REST API in WordPress. You can bubble that content up to your front end, or you can bubble it up to your application, or you can bubble it up to an integration with a third-party system. WordPress seems like it's uniquely positioned to be a great fit in a headless stack because it's so easy for it to both be the central repository of content and then share that content with everyone, regardless of what sort of system they're in.
Yeah, I love that. And the example I think that I like to lean to is when you're looking deeper into marketing nowadays, hardly ever are you getting marketing that is just written once and that's it. Like you start, and there's a lot of kind of thought leadership around this, is where we're going to start with is we're going to record a video. Then we're going to take that YouTube video and we're going to transcribe it and make it a blog post. Then we're going to make that blog post into a resource guide. Then we're going to cut snippets out of each of these videos. Then we're going to make those social media posts. Then those social media posts are going to get cross-posted across every single thing. And then after we do that, we're going to do it all over again as like a retroactive for all these different things. So when we look at the life cycle of a piece of content on marketing, hardly ever is it in just one square. And that's all it's going to do, because it's going to get posted as like 300 different things. So being at the core of that, which is where WordPress is highly beneficial, not only to your marketing team, but also to all the other teams that rely on that flywheel of knowledge and that flywheel of content. So being able to be at the core of that is so powerful. And I think when we talk about kind of like this little life cycle of where all the marketing pieces are, and we kind of like look at this, the idea of headless is such a natural pair to those things. Because I just mentioned like 10 different platforms. So email, social, video, blog writing, content writing, resource guides, like documentation, all of those different things are all run by different platforms, and they all need to sort of have like a quarterback in the middle. So having WordPress in a headless or composable architecture is absolutely perfect. It really is at the core of what you would want from any CMS, right? So it's going to be able to store your content. It's an easy authoring experience, and I can take that content and port it to anywhere else I want to go. So yeah, really excited about like the future of the headless like content authoring experience. I think it's really powerful.
Awesome. Well, Matt, we've had a great chance to talk here. Is there anything else that we didn't hit as it relates to headless or WordPress that you wanted to cover before we call it a day?
The biggest thing that I want folks to take away from this kind of conversation is that Vercel and WordPress are a fantastic pair with one another. The concept of that I like to explain to people when I'm explaining, Vercel, if you're hearing about this for the first time, is we want to be able to have fast sites and fast teams. And everything at Vercel is going to path back to those two things. So our managed infrastructure offering is going to be able to have fast sites, right? You can just turn a key, push a button on your page, whatever you want to do, and you're going to have a fast site. It's going to be delivered to your users at the edge. It's going to be extremely quick. And then fast teams, right? So our teams are going to be able to see their preview environments. We're not going to have to sort of like have a bunch of drag on our performance of it as a team. And then what you're doing is when you want to go through this process is you want to be able to pick the tools that are going to complement that process. You're going to complement your fast team and your fast site. And I can't think of a better kind of pair than a headless CMS with Vercel, and in this case, WordPress. So I think it's just a really, really easy kind of match to make it to where your teams can go fast and your site is fast, all by default. Not to mention kind of unfurling the can of worms for secure by default, and also AI native. So that's another thing that folks might want to be looking at is with Vercel, and this is another kind of piece to all of this, is with Vercel, we have our AI SDK, which allows you to build with whatever model you want on the back end, go ahead and deploy whatever AI application you would want on the front end. And again, that matches really perfectly with your WordPress content. Have a big pool of content wherever that is. That's going to get built up and sent out into my large language model. And then how do I get all of that out of the large language model and onto a page? Well, with Vercel and the AI SDK. So this is kind of where we sit, is in these kind of pillars here. And if anybody has any questions or wants to chat more with us, just hop over to vercel.com. That's going to be where our managed infrastructure offering is. If you're interested in how to work with a front-end framework, head over to nextjs.org. There's a host of WordPress templates. There's a host of other CMS templates as well. You can also do some things that are out of the content world, like we've been talking about AI a lot. If you're interested in SaaS or e-commerce, there's also a ton of things that we can do over there. And of course, AmericanEagle.com. I've been driving by the office maybe for 100 straight years, it feels like. So, it's a match made in heaven with this crew.
Awesome. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your expertise and insight on the call today.
Sweet. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Awesome. Have a good one, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks again for joining us at The Edge. I am your host, Landon DePasquale, and until the next episode, feed your WordPress obsession. For more information about today's episode and the topics discussed today, check out our dedicated WordPress Edge landing page at AmericanEagle.com Studios.